Welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please leave a rate and review. Today, we'll be taking a look at the Memphis Tigers, who finished 10-3 last season. They capped off their year last year with a Liberty Bowl win over Iowa State Cyclones. They wrapped up their 2024 spring practice with their spring game on April 20th. Today, we have a special guest joining us today. He is the beat reporter for the Memphis Tigers and the Memphis Grizzlies at the Commercial Appeal. He never gets too high or too low. He is Jonah Dylan. Jonah can be found at the Jonah Dylan on X. Welcome to the show, Jonah.
Thanks for having me, guys. Was that it? Those highlights were something. D'Angelo Williams, that's a real deep cut right there. So we're starting off going all the way to the top.
All the way. Justice does a lot.
Yeah, I try to find some old video. Sometimes it can be really hard, but sometimes we get lucky.
Yeah, it's very. I'm sure Tigers fans will be happy to see that. So there you go. A Hall of Famer, college football Hall of Famer, as of last year, by the way.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I think that's where I got that video from, was his induction speech. I think it was one of the highlights they showed.
Well, Jonah, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What led you into sports journalism and covering the Tigers, and how long you've been covering them?
Yeah, this will be my second season on the beat. I got here to Memphis last July, so right before summer practices kind of started for last year's football season. That was kind of my induction into not only to the Tigers, but to covering sports full time. I had a couple other jobs. I had covered government before that and breaking news and crime. So I had a different kind of background coming into this, but it was a really exciting season. Obviously, not only did Memphis have a pretty good season, go 10-3, but every game was kind of life or death, whether or not they won or lost. They were winning and losing in almost every game, I believe, besides the last two games of the season. So there was always some jeopardy, which kept us on our toes as beat writers, obviously. But it was an exciting season, and I think next year, obviously, 2024 is going to be an even more exciting one.
We agree. We think Memphis is one of the front runners for the automatic berth there for the G5. All right, let's move over to the position where it all starts on offense, and that's the quarterback. They're all ACC second-team quarterbacks. Seth Hennigan returns. They do lose backup quarterback Tevin Carter to Tennessee State, and they bring in freshman Arrington Maiden. For those not familiar with Memphis, can you tell us how important Seth Hennigan is to this team?
Yeah, so Seth Hennigan, one of the biggest stories of the offseason, and there have been a lot, and I'm sure we'll touch on all of them, is just the fact that Seth Hennigan decided to come back to be it kind of gets lost, but to be a 4-year starting quarterback at the same college is crazy in this day and age of college football, especially somebody who started as a true freshman, right? It's and somebody, obviously, if you look at how he's done, especially how he did over the back half of last season, he could have had opportunities to go play elsewhere. He certainly could have played at a Power 5 level, Power 4, I guess now. And I think it's pretty amazing that he's decided to come back. When you think about it in the context of where college football is headed, he's already Memphis' all-time leading passer. Basically every record that there is for the Tigers that he doesn't already have, he's likely to break in 2024. And he's obviously the best returning quarterback in the AAC. If you look, across the country, he's getting buzz as one of the best returning quarterbacks, best quarterbacks, period, in the country. And rightfully so. If you look at how he kind of turned things around, he was playing through injuries through a lot of last season, especially in the first half of the season, things that weren't knocking him out of games, but were affecting him. And after the loss to Tulane, he kind of turned everything around. You look at his stats from then on to the rest of the season, he basically just carried this team. And for him to come back is a huge story, obviously. And I think that they're expecting him to take even another step and kind of cement himself as really one of the best players, period, not only in the AAC, but in all Group of 5.
Can you tell us more about early enrollee true freshman Arrington Maiden?
Yeah, so Arrington Maiden is still a 17-year-old who they're very excited about. He's come in as an early enrollee, which is something that Seth Hennigan did way back in 2021 when he became the starter. Now, Seth Hennigan started as a true freshman. Obviously, the plan is not for Arrington Maiden to start as a true freshman, but he is somebody that they're excited about. And this has been a place in the past, right? you look at Seth Hennigan, likely through this year, going to be a 4-year starter. Brady White before that played for 3 years. So this is a place where they like to find guys and develop them and then keep them as their quarterback. And that means if you're somebody who's a freshman, you might get a shot. And once you get that shot, obviously, if you play well, those guys, Brady White and Seth Hennigan, have obviously been very good. But if you play well, you can hold on to this job for a while. And so next year, there's going to be a quarterback competition. Now, obviously, other people are going to be involved in it. Some of them might be the other quarterbacks are on this roster now. They're going to get a quarterback, obviously, in the recruiting class next year. And then you never know with the transfer portal. But he's definitely somebody who could be a future starter. Right now, the interesting part is he's kind of competing with Harris Boyd and Cade Cunningham for that backup quarterback job, which coaches said throughout the spring was kind of an open competition. Now, you would probably expect Arrington Maiden to win it, and you would kind of hope that he wins it. But that's also going to be part of the discussion for next year, potentially, is how those guys do, because they could all be back next season. And so the hope for everybody is that Arrington Maiden or anyone else not named Seth Hennigan is not going to play this year. But he is somebody to kind of watch. We got to see him obviously in the spring game for the first time. And then he could definitely play a role, next year in the quarterback competition.
How would you describe his style of play?
Yeah, he's even Arrington.
Yeah, Arrington.
Yeah, I mean he stands out because he's pretty tall and he's kind of a wiry, and he's got that frame where he can throw the ball really far. Now, one of the things we saw in this spring game was, a throw that might be a couple inches off or something, which is exactly the kind of thing that you think can be fixed. He's got a pretty strong arm, and I think that's something that people are going to be excited about. And he's somebody who, when you talk to his coaches from high school, they talk about his mind and how he knows the position. He knows what everybody else on the field is supposed to be doing. And you're talking about, again, somebody who was 17 years old when he enrolled here in college. And so you're talking about a 16 and 17-year-old playing high school football and kind of telling his teammates, you're supposed to do this, and knowing the playbook for other people. So that's something that Ryan Silverfield and Tim Cramsey are obviously going to be excited about here. And that's another situation where if you have somebody in your program who has a year to kind of get to know the playbook, get to know how things work, obviously the hope would be that he would redshirt this year. And then be ready to go next year with that knowledge as he continues to develop. Because he's already, he's working on his body, obviously trying to get stronger. And I think that's going to be something else to see as he kind of goes through this season and then the next one.
Do you think there's any concern with the depth behind Hennigan and the experience of those guys? Or
yeah, I mean, it's a good one because obviously Tevin Carter was the backup last year, like you said, and he's gone. So if Arrington Maiden does become the guy and Seth Hennigan does get hurt and he has to play, then suddenly a true freshman is kind of getting thrown into the fire for a team that is expecting to win almost all of its games. So there's really no margin for error, right? You can't break in a quarterback the way that even Seth Hennigan did when he was a true freshman, where it was like, let's throw this guy into the fire and kind of see how it goes. It would be interesting to see, push comes to shove, what the decision would be there, because there are some other guys. Now, Harris Boyd is someone who's been in the program, and he was there last year, obviously, but that doesn't mean that he has experience playing in a game. So it's hard to say how they would kind of handle that situation. I think definitely there would be concern just because of the caliber of player that we know Seth Hennigan is. So anytime you're going to drop from that, it's going to be hard to kind of project how things are going to go.
Well, let's move over to the running game. Would you believe it? The Tigers get another running back into the NFL. Blake Watson signed as a UDFA contract with the Broncos. He leaves some big shoes to fill. How did that room look in the spring?
Yeah, so it was all about Mario Anderson, and that's going to be the story, really not just with the running back room, not just with the offense, but he's been the guy that people have talked about, at least especially through the spring, before some of the guys that came in the spring. And again, you can see why, because he was the leading rusher for South Carolina last year. He was USC was after him and Oklahoma was after him, and he chose to come to Memphis, which is obviously, that in and of itself is something that Memphis fans are going to be excited about, and it's going to kind of turn heads. Now, even people you talk to around the program, when Memphis is recruiting running backs, it's different than recruiting any other position, because Memphis is known as RBU. There's plenty of guys who have come through here recently: Tony Pollard, Antonio Gibson, Patrick Taylor, Joe Henderson, Kenneth Gainwell. The list goes on. I've kind of got it stuck in my head. It just runs in repeat in the background all the time. And those names are all on the wall in the practice facility, by the way. And now Blake Watson, you got to add that one to the list too, assuming he makes the Broncos opening roster. So Mario Anderson is a grad transfer. He's coming here for one season. He's coming here to fill the shoes that Blake Watson left. Now, that's going to be difficult because Blake Watson was really good for this team last year. He rushed for 1,000 yards. He was a weapon in the pass game. And he was really consistent throughout the season. That was one of the big things. Memphis didn't have a 1,000-yard rusher the season before, and consistency was one of the things they were looking for. And so now you look at this running back room, and you've got Mario Anderson, who we know is going to be the main guy, and there's a lot of depth behind him, as there was last year behind Blake Watson, but he kind of just took the job and made it his own. So there's going to be other names to know for sure, and we'll obviously touch on them. But Mario Anderson is going to be the guy. He's going to get headlines, I think, not just in Memphis, but I think throughout the group of five going into the season.
They also brought in a transfer from UMass, Greg DeRoziers Jr. It might be French. I'm not sure on the pronunciation.
DeRozier is what I was told.
DeRozier.
Ryan Silverfield
Right.
also said that he botched the name the other day. So you guys are on the same page. That's what I believe it is. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, so again, he's joining a room where you've got Mario Anderson, like we said, who's going to be the top guy. Now, Sutton Smith, I'm sure we'll touch on, is another huge guy's going to play a huge role. I think Greg DeRozier he could play a role on special teams, and he could be somebody who plays a bigger role maybe next season. Now, depth is going to be a big thing, and obviously running backs can get injured really quickly. So I think a lot of guys are going to be ready. But I think, and they've been trying to involve running backs in ways besides just handing the ball off to them. That's one of the things with Sutton Smith, but with other guys too. And I think he has the kind of skill set where you could see him catching passes out of the backfield, maybe even, lining up in the slot. And so that's definitely something to watch. As we go into the season, I think the ways that they try to involve some of these guys to make sure they can get as many of them on the field as possible.
You touch on Sutton Smith there. He returns, and Brandon Thomas also returns. What can you tell us about the rest of this room, and what kind of split do you think that we're going to see from this team in this room here in 2024?
Yeah, so Brandon Thomas, really interesting career in Memphis, because if you go back a couple of seasons, he was the top rusher at Memphis, and dealt with injuries, dealt with a lot of things, and really wasn't involved at all at the beginning of last season. It seemed like he was just kind of an afterthought. And then he ended up kind of getting deployed halfway through the season as the goal line back, and was amazing basically in that role. Basically, if you give this guy the ball around the end zone, he's going to score a touchdown almost every time. And Blake Watson, who I just talked about how great he was, which is true. The one thing that he wasn't great at was carrying the ball inside the 5-yard line, because he fumbled 3 times inside the 5-yard line, which is kind of a stunning stat. And so they took that job away from him, and they gave it to Brandon Thomas, who I think, basically by the end of the season, he was scoring 2 or 3 touchdowns. It felt like every game. And so based on the way that he performed in that role, I would expect him to do that again. Then Sutton Smith is kind of the big wild card really on this whole offense, because we've seen throughout his time at Memphis, he has an ability to do things that nobody else on the field can do. And the best example is go back to the AutoZone Liberty Bowl and the touchdown that he scored, a reception where he catches the ball and there's 3 guys who are about to tackle him for what looks like a 3-yard gain. And he pulls off some move that I've watched it 100 times and I still don't really understand what happened. Like my only explanation is like I tweeted about right after, is that the defense glitched right after he got the ball, because it looks like you're playing Madden and they just stop moving. And then he just sprints away from everybody else like it's nothing. And that was one play, but he does stuff like that all season. And so for him, obviously consistency is the big thing, because people are always going to ask, well, why doesn't Sutton Smith just get the ball every play? And so it's going to be consistency. Can he run on the inside? Can you give him the ball, and can he just take a 3-4 yard gain? Because we know when we see those highlights what he's able to do, but what can he do on an every play basis? And they said going to last season, they're going to line him up in the slot. We saw that a little bit. We saw trying to get him on the field. I'm thinking we're going to see more of that this year, just because we know what he can do, and he's going to have another offseason to work on the rest of his game. And so that's something that's going to be a big one really to watch, to see how he's involved. And then, like you said, what the split is in terms of workload.
So do you think it'll be like last year? Watson pretty much dominated those touches. It was like 45% to Sutton Smith's like 15%. Do we see Mario Anderson just like a 1-for-1 like switch with Blake, like what Blake Watson did, or how do you see that panning out?
I would expect at the beginning of the season to basically see Mario Anderson handle that Blake Watson workload. Now the variables are going to be, what does Mario Anderson give them out of the backfield, because Blake Watson was so valuable as a pass catcher. If they decide that Sutton Smith is a more valuable pass catcher, he could definitely eat into that. And when you're on the field from passing downs, it doesn't mean you're not going to get the ball in a handoff, and so that's something. You could end up being more carries for Sutton Smith, even if those are on what look like passing downs. But I think those, you would have to think that Mario Anderson will get the brunt of the carries, and then Sutton Smith is going to be involved. And I think that's one of the biggest questions on the offense, is how involved is he going to be, and in what ways is he going to be involved? But yeah, those would be the two guys, and then Brandon Thomas around the goal line. I think we'd expect to see in short yardage situations.
Moving back to the passing game, the Tigers lose Joseph Skates to graduation, but bring back their top two receivers in Rock Taylor and Demir Blakumsa. How did the wide receivers look in the spring?
Yeah, that's one of the strongest position groups on the team. Even as we just got finished talking about the running backs, which is another one, which, this is a team that's supposed to be pretty good. So Rock Taylor is, he's at the very least the best returning wide receiver in the AAC. He's going to be a preseason first team all conference guy. You could easily tell me he's going to be the top receiver in the conference, one of the top receivers in the group of five for sure. And so he's going to be the top guy. Had a breakout year last year, obviously, and then built on it. We talked about Seth Hennigan coming back and how big that was. Rock Taylor announced around the same time that he was coming back. That's as big of a deal, because he's another guy who easily could have gone to play at a power conference level. And those two guys have played together for 4 years now. So they've developed together. Rock Taylor, like I said, has gone from being a guy who was kind of just in the mix to being like the 100%, this is our number one receiver. And now he enters the year with those expectations. And then Demir Blakumsa was a guy who played really well last year as a transfer, and was one of the top receivers on this team, and can do a lot of different things. So how is he deployed? Because he was good in the slot last year. Will he continue to play there? And then you've got Kobe Drake coming back, who was another one of the contributors last year, who also plays in the slot. So it's going to be interesting to see how, those snaps are kind of how they go, because Kobe Drake and Demir Blakumsa can do similar things. On paper, those are going to be the top three receivers. But I think you're going to see guys move around a lot. You're going to see a lot of different bodies in there, kind of alongside Rock Taylor, who's going to be the consistent threat, both, short, medium, and then obviously big plays down the field. We saw that last year. And yeah, I think this is a really strong group. I think there's a lot of potential for guys to win opportunities behind those three guys during training camp, both transfers and some guys that have come in, because there are going to be opportunities to be on the field. Because we saw somebody like Kobe Drake last year, who was kind of fourth or fifth on the depth chart, make a bunch of huge catches on third downs and throughout the game. So it's going to be interesting. That's one of the positions to kind of watch throughout summer and fall practice to see how the pecking order plays out.
You mentioned that they brought in some transfers. They brought in Jacoby Banks from Houston and Jair Shorter from Auburn, formerly of North Texas as well. What can you tell us about those guys, and maybe what kind of role they can play in 2024?
Yeah, both those guys were impressive during the spring, and I think that they're both in line to play significant roles. Like I said, when you run as many plays and you score as many points as Memphis did last year, there's a lot of opportunities for everybody to catch passes, not even if you're not the number one guy at a position on the depth chart. And like you said, those are the two guys, I think, from a transfer perspective, that we would expect to see play a significant role. And then the other kind of wild card is Keondae Henry, who's a 4-star wide receiver, who wasn't here in the spring but is coming in the summer, and he's one of the highest ranked recruits in Memphis history. So it was a big deal that he signed here, that he decided to come here, flipped his commitments a couple of times before he signed with Memphis. And this is a place that, as we go through these positions, this is a place that has not played a lot of true freshmen in the past couple of years, with the obvious outlier being Seth Hennigan as a freshman quarterback. But I think that Keondae Henry is someone who, if he comes in and impresses right away, and like we said, there's going to be opportunities, he could kind of play into that mix this season. Obviously, he's somebody who they expect to play in the next couple of years, but it'll be interesting to see how he kind of fits in this year.
Memphis returns their starting tight end, Anthony Lansfear, who ran the third most routes on the team last year. If you were to describe the tight end usage for this offense to somebody who's never caught a game, how would you describe it?
Yeah, super important on third downs, and really important in the red zone, which is like, yeah, this is what a tight end is, right? I mean, it's like, that's how it goes. Now, when Caden Prescorn was here last year, he was kind of a superstar player, and we're seeing obviously what he's able to do now at Ole Miss. So when you have a player like that, you're going to have to use him in as many ways as possible. And then around in the red zone, they used a lot of different guys, and Brennan Doyle caught some touchdown passes as a guy who came in the red zone. They like to use multiple tight ends when they're down there close to the goal line. But I think Anthony Lansfear is another guy, like we talked about with Rock Taylor, maybe not to the same extent, but he's developed a lot throughout his time here. And I think with all those guys coming back, he's somebody who's going to play a pretty big role, obviously, going into the season.
With the exception of last year, the tight ends have been able to grab like 7 touchdowns a season. Like you said, they get a lot of work in there in the red zone. Lansfear only had 3 last year. Do we see more of that red zone work for him here in 2024?
We could. I mean, I would expect his stats to be higher this year than they were last year. I think that, again, the relationship with him and Seth Hennigan grows. Last year was his first year as a starter, playing a really significant role. But like I said, Brennan Doyle is someone who's, he's going to be involved. And if they find it, like we saw with Brandon Thomas, if they find something that works in the red zone, whether it's a pass catcher or a running back, they're just going to keep going to it until somebody stops it. And if you can carve out a role for yourself on a team, you got to do it anyway. So if somebody else is able to come in and do that, it wouldn't surprise me. But yeah, I would think across the board, I would expect his stats to be higher. Just the way this offense is going to kind of develop going to 2024.
All right, so between like Doyle and Lansfear and this whole tight end room, how did it look in the spring?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of those rooms where they pretty much look exactly the same as last year. So every single person now things are obviously going to change, and you never know with injuries, but you expect they're all going to have the same role they had last year, except for they should all be better. And I think that the coaches, that's the kind of way that they talked about it, of like, we brought back the same guys. Everybody knows what they can do because we saw it last year. Everybody should be better because we've had a year to get better. And they're going to bring in guys, they're obviously bringing in guys who are going to compete for spots in the future. But I think we should expect it to look basically like it did last year. And we should expect Anthony Lansfear to take another step forward as the kind of number one tight end, in the kind of vein of the past couple tight ends who we've had in Memphis, maybe with the exception of Prescorn, who's kind of an outlier. But yeah, this is a place that there's been opportunities for tight ends, and guys have been pretty consistent. And I think consistency is something to watch with him this year.
Moving over to the offensive line, they lose starting center Jacob Likes to graduation. They're starting left tackle and right guard to transfer, but they were able to bring back Xavier Hill at right tackle and Jonah Gamble at left guard. How did the coaching staff address these losses in the offseason?
Yeah, by bringing in as many transfers as you can count, basically. So the offensive line is totally rebuilt, and even those guys, you mentioned Jonah Gamble and Xavier Hill, they're likely to play different positions than they played last year. So we're going to likely see a different person at every single position on the offensive line from last season. And obviously that's going to lead to questions, but I think that they're pretty happy about the caliber of player that they brought in. So Jalen Nichols comes in. He was slated to be South Carolina's starting left tackle in 2023 before he got injured. So he was working his way back still from a knee injury during Tiger spring practice. But if he's healthy, he should be in there. And then you've obviously got Jonah Gamble, who might need to play center, because Jacob Likes, it's one of those things where you lose Jacob Likes. He was a really good player for this team, but he was, in terms of leadership, and we'll get to this with some of the guys on the defense, in terms of leadership, he was huge for this team, both just in what he did for the offensive line, his relationship with Seth Hennigan. And so you've got to replace that. You've got to find a center who's going to have that rapport with Seth Hennigan, which is going to be important. And that's why it could be somebody like Jonah Gamble, who's been in the program. And then Xavier Hill is going to be a really key player, likely to play a guard for this team, as somebody who I think started at 3 different positions last season. And the offensive line coaches and even Ryan Silverlip said he could play any position, which is obviously incredibly valuable. when you have injuries and guys shuffling around. So it's going to look a lot different, but I think there's reason to be optimistic about where it's headed.
Who do you feel? I mean, so if we assume Nichols is going to start at one tackle, Gamble's at center, and Hill's at one guard, who do you think the other tackle and guard might be?
Yeah, it's gonna depend on injuries. Like Trent Holler is somebody who they brought in who was injured during spring practices, and so he could play a factor. Malachi Breland is somebody who they were really excited about last year, and he got to start in the Liberty Bowl and played really well as a true freshman. So his development is another one to watch. John Young is going to be a guy who could be the right tackle. And then the difference, I mean, we felt pretty confident about where it was after spring practices, but then Chris Adams comes in as a transfer from Old Dominion, who can play both tackle positions, and I think he could factor into this equation now too. So now they're suddenly, okay, what is Jalen Nichols in terms of where is his health as we go into the summer, and then where is Chris Adams going to play, and how is he going to factor into it, and then again, who's going to play center, because it seemed like Jonah Gamble was there in the spring, but they also said that they were trying to have 10 different guys take snaps. And it's going to be one of those things where once they decide who the center is, you can kind of build things out from there. And so, yeah, there's a couple of names that are still in the mix, I would say, as of now.
All right, Jonah, if you have to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
I'd have to go Sutton Smith. I mean, I think for all the reasons I talked about before, I think he's somebody who has as much natural talent as anybody we see out here on this roster, especially on the offensive side of the ball. And he's just a highlight reel kind of player. Everything he does, every time he touches the ball, you got to stop what you're doing and pay attention, because he might just reel off a 60-yard touchdown out of nowhere. And he's somebody, once he gets more touches, obviously he needs to work on his consistency, and there's a lot of things he can get better at. But I think he's one of those players that if he is able to do it and put those things together, you're talking about somebody who has game-breaking potential, and who can really elevate this offense to a whole other level.
All right, let's move over to the defensive side of the ball and talk about the guys up front along the defensive line. They lose some key pieces to that line, and Jalen Allen, who is now with the Denver Broncos, and Josh Ellison to graduation. What did they do to shore up that defensive line in the offseason?
Yeah, similar to the offensive line, just brought in a ton of transfers. That's what you got to do, and in this day and age, obviously, and I think that's one of those position groups that, and we'll talk about this a lot with the defense, that needs to improve going to this season. But there's a lot of reason to be excited. Reggie Grimes is somebody who comes in from Oklahoma, and could have a pretty big impact. And then there's a lot of guys who have been in the program: Cormonte Hamilton, William Whitlow, especially on the ends of that defensive line, who have been developing for the past couple of years, and they're expecting bigger things from this year. So another position group where there's a lot to sort out before the season starts, and the pecking order is definitely not set in stone. But I think a lot of names and a lot of guys in there who could definitely play a role.
Was there any defensive lineman that in particular stood out during the spring?
There were a lot of guys. I mean, I think what's interesting is there's a lot of guys, more so than any other position group, there's a lot of guys who are coming in after the spring. You talk about DJ Allen, you talk about Cabo Benton, who's both local guys. DJ Allen is an interesting one, obviously, who is from around here, went to Germantown, and then kind of took a weird path to go to Purdue in the spring, and then transfers back to Memphis. And now is coming as a transfer, even though he's just out of high school. And then obviously Reggie Grimes. So I think there's a lot to kind of work out even after spring. I think that it was clear, Cormonte Hamilton is going to play a really big role, especially leadership role on this team and in that unit. And so that's one of the things that I would say after spring. But yeah, it's going to be a lot to figure out.
I'm assuming there's no next Jalen Allen, at least not yet anyway.
No, I mean, Jalen Allen, we talked about it with Jacob Blakes, right? Like, you talk about leadership and you talk about somebody who's just like affecting the entire team just with, just what he does, how he talks about football, he talks about his teammates, how he approaches the game. Jalen Allen is one of those guys, and this is one of the reasons that NFL teams are interested in him. He just never stops, and he just never gives up. He's undersized, right? He's just always going to battle. He approached every like interaction from a defensive end and an offensive lineman, like a wrestling match, me versus him. And I'm gonna beat this guy. And so he had one of those mentalities that like, you just, it's a cliche, obviously you can't teach that, but you really can't. And so that's a big deal. And it's a big deal through the whole defense. Like, I think it's important to note, we talk about transfers coming in, we talk about talent level and all this stuff. And you talk about glue and guys who bring the whole team together and guys who can, they get other guys to play harder and they play harder themselves, and that makes the whole team better. And you can't take that for granted. And Jalen Allen was one of those players. And so you can try to replace obviously what he did. You can look at his stats and say, well, I can get a guy who get that many sacks, which could be true. But he's somebody who's going to be hard to replace. And, leadership is going to be something that is needed a lot on this defense. And especially on the defensive line. And that's why I say, Cormonte Hamilton has been in the program. He's from Memphis. He's the kind of guy who could step into that kind of a role. And so that's why he could be a big factor on that defensive line.
The linebacking group brought back their leading tackler from a year ago in Chandler Martin, but they lost their second leading tackler in Jeffrey Canton-Arku and Sincere Evans. What did Memphis do to address those losses?
Yeah, brought in a lot of linebackers. And linebackers are, Memphis' new defensive coordinator, Jordan Hankins, who's the linebackers coach. And he's made it clear throughout the whole season, the whole offseason since he became defensive coordinator, there's going to be a lot of linebackers on the field at all times, basically. That's what Memphis is going to do. And so he lost Jeff Canton-Arku, who was a huge player for this team. And he said, I'm just going to bring in as many linebackers as I can find, and I'm going to put them all in the field, hopefully at the same time. And so there's a lot of guys who have come in. Now, Elijah Herring is the one who's going to get the most headlines, and the one who we would expect to play the biggest role alongside Chandler Martin. Because at least last season, now we don't know exactly what the scheme is going to look like, but last season there were Chandler Martin and Jeff Canton-Arku were the two guys that were on the field most of the time. There wasn't anybody else who was always out there. So I would expect those two guys to be out there, all the time. And then we'll see with how many other guys are going to be and in what situations. But you look at Matt Hudson, Jaden Flaker, those guys have been, very successful and very productive at other places. So it's not like you're bringing in, let's take a chance on this guy. Like, they're bringing in guys who have been very productive at other levels. And you might say, oh, well, you did it at Harvard, so, who cares? You tackle guys in the Ivy League. That's not the same as this. Chandler Martin, last season, 2 seasons ago, was playing in the FCS at East Tennessee State, and he came to Memphis and became, Memphis' leading tackler and one of the best players on this team, period. And now he's a preseason All-American. So they've had a track record with guys like that. And so this is 100% the strength of the defense. And it's going to be the strength of this team. And this whole defense is going to be built around what Chandler Martin and Elijah Herring can do.
So they did bring in, like you mentioned, Elijah Herring from Tennessee as a big get, but they also got Javante Mackey, another big get, but we're finding out there's a little bit of news there. So what can you tell us about that room?
Yeah, so Javante Mackey came in during the winter portal as somebody who, once again, very productive at Arkansas State last year, and a Memphis native, but got injured and was out during spring practice. And Ryan Silverfield saying that he's out for the season after spring practices, and so we won't see him this year. Now, I would say that he's somebody still who you could see playing a pretty significant role in the future because of what he did at Arkansas State and because of the track record of linebackers. And so that's definitely a name to keep kind of in the back of your head. Maybe not this season, obviously, but going into 2025, depending on how the rest of this room looks.
Moving over to the defensive backfield, they also took a hit this offseason, losing Simeon Blair to graduation, Cameron Smith to TCU, and Diego Brumfield to Mississippi State. How did the coaching staff address these losses, and what can we expect from the defensive backs in 2024?
Yeah, this is one of the position groups, maybe the biggest one that they know needs to improve this season. Secondary struggled a lot, and this was some of the games, especially thinking back to the SMU game, there were just guys wide open 10 yards down the field, it seemed like all the time. And there were individual performers who did well, and it was just the consistency was a problem. And obviously you see that some of these guys did well, and they left and went to bigger programs. Diego Brumfield's an amazing story. He came from an NAIA program, played 1 year at Memphis and now Mississippi State. But you mentioned Simeon Blair, and we go back to what I was talking about before, leadership. Simeon Blair was a hugely important leader, came in as someone who was a captain at Arkansas and came here and was a captain, even though he only played here one season. And so you've got to replace him. Greg Rubin is going to be the guy at safety who's going to have to kind of not only fill the shoes on the field, but also from a leadership perspective, because he's been in the program, as upperclassman and kind of has that sweat equity in the program. And then you look at the rest of, you really look at the cornerbacks, and you would expect things are going to look pretty different. Diego Brumfield is gone. Davion Ross was injured in the second game last season and missed the whole season. And they were pretty bummed about that because they had hoped that he was going to play a pretty big role last season. So he's back in the fold. Julian Barnett was getting raved about as much as anybody during spring practices as another cornerback. And then after spring practices, the biggest news is they bring in Kobe Minor. He comes in from Indiana, where he was an honorable mention All Big Ten player last year, and is that kind of top cornerback that they were looking for throughout last season, and that they were obviously looking for in the transfer portal, and that you would expect to be kind of the main guy at that position, and is a huge boost to that room, and a room that obviously needs to improve a lot this season.
All right, I asked you on the offensive side, but defensive side, if you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
Yeah, I think I want to say Julian Barnett, but I'm going to stick with Kobe Minor just because, and it feels new. I think he's going to get a lot of love as we go into this season. But like I said, this was the place that Memphis struggled so last year, and so when people see guys putting up big numbers, and Chandler Martin, we've talked about him a little bit, but obviously he's a superstar player. He might be Memphis' best player, period. And he's going to be someone that people notice. But Kobe Minor is a player that they're obviously very excited about. Could be the guy who kind of brings all this stuff together. And like he'll tell you, if you don't believe it, go watch the tape of him guarding Marvin Harrison Jr. last season when he was in Indiana. And so he's, now going to play against AAC receivers. If you can guard Marvin Harrison Jr., you can probably guard anyone. I think that would be fair to say. And somebody who has the potential to come in as a transfer and immediately be an all-conference type of guy, which is obviously huge if you can find anybody who can do that. And so that would be the pick. I don't know if it really counts as a breakout. I might be breaking the rules there, but I'm going to go with that.
Now that for us.
Now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you feel is the most concerning?
Yeah, I think defensive line is one for some of the reasons that I mentioned is like this. It was not a unit that got a lot of pressure on quarterbacks last year. You got to improve that. You can't just rely on linebackers to tackle everybody. Although Chandler Martin will tackle everybody, but I think like sorting out the pecking order, because there's so many guys in that room, both guys who have been in the program who they're expecting to take another step, transfers. And then there's a good amount of freshmen in that room who obviously have talent. And so there's just a lot to get through there. And obviously, look, it helps to have depth when guys get injured, or you need to, obviously, the defensive line, are going to be shuffling guys in and out, but you really need to find who is the guy who we can rely on to get to the quarterback consistently. And that's something that they've been looking for. Obviously, Jalen Allen was the top guy last year, but somebody who can get there consistently and can do it throughout the course of the season and can really affect how the rest of the defense is going to play. Because if you can't do that, then you're kind of putting everybody else at a disadvantage, and it's going to affect how you have to scheme your entire defense. So I would think that throughout fall practices, they're going to be thinking we need to find somebody who can do that, or we're going to have to change the way that we're going to kind of approach this. And so that's the place that I would start.
As we've talked about so far tonight, they've brought in a lot of players already through the portal. But is there any particular position where you think they might still be looking for a player or two in the portal?
I mean, I think they're mostly close to being done. I wouldn't be surprised to see more defensive backs come in, both because you've got a great competition there, and because they're looking for guys who can also play multiple positions, especially in the defensive backfield, and potentially somebody who can play safety too, because there's still, spots up for grabs theoretically back there with Simeon Blair being gone, and obviously the way that Cam Smith played last year. So I think that's another place where if there were more guys coming in, I would expect it to be there. But they've obviously, like I said, they brought in transfers throughout the winter and throughout the spring, so there's plenty of guys there.
Well, let's go over to the opposite end of the spectrum. What would you say is the main strength of this team?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick on the offense. Seth Hennigan, right? You can just say the quarterbacks and just really pick one. I mean, Seth Hennigan, if you look at the way that he's getting talked about nationally, he's being talked about as potentially one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the country. I mean, ESPN had him in that range. And so we're not even talking about a group of five there, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. He obviously could have gone and played at a power program. But when you have a quarterback like that, and we're looking at Memphis in relation to the other teams in the group of five, and you just start with, okay, well, this team has the best quarterback. Well, then you're just automatically way ahead of everybody. Now, obviously, everyone's got to play, and you still got to play the games and do everything. But if you have the best quarterback, you're at a huge advantage. And I think a lot of people are saying, they're picking Seth Hennigan as one of the best quarterbacks in the country. And so I think you just have to start there with strengths. And then I just think defensively, linebacker is clearly a strength with Chandler Martin, and then with what Elijah Herring was able to do last year as Tennessee's leading tackler, and then to come here and join those two guys together, definitely the best linebacker core in the conference, and obviously one of the strongest in the country.
When it comes to recruitment of new players and retention of existing players, NIL and transfer portal play a huge role nowadays. What can you tell us about the impacts the NIL and the portal have had there at Memphis?
Yeah, huge. I mean, with the FedEx deal, obviously it's just changed everything. But when you look at it, a lot of it is about how are you comparing to the rest of the teams in your conference, whatever that conference may be. And now Memphis is, especially with SMU leaving, Memphis has skyrocketed to the top. In football, in all sports almost, but obviously especially in football. And this changes the way that, like, the caliber of player you can go after. And we've already seen it in the spring with going after players who are considering, I'm considering Memphis, and I'm also considering only power schools besides that. And so now it's not like, let's look at the offers that this guy has who chose Memphis, and it's all, lower programs. It's like people are choosing Memphis over those programs. And then it's been a huge help with retention. I mean, one of the reasons that all those guys stayed is because now there's so much more money in this program, and you don't have to leave to a lot. We see it, and you guys know better than I do. Like, group of five guys come in, they have a great season, and then they leave because someone's going to pay them more money. And now you have a situation here where it's not actually going to happen. Like, you might, if you come here and you play really well, the money might be comparable to what you would get if you left. And so that's causing a lot of players to decide to stay.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the only other G5 I would say that I feel is pretty wealthy in terms of money, and I don't know about the NIL situation, but just in general, is Liberty. But that FedEx deal has really kind of set Memphis apart in the group of five for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you look at and Memphis and Liberty are the two places that brought back a quarterback who was played at a high level, right? Like, where else did they do that? So that's usually a pretty good tell of where they are in terms of the players that they're able to attract.
We'll have to ask that to South Florida. Byron Brown, I think, was probably the only other big kind of name that came back. But yeah, when it seems more and more that the demands of the head coach are really turning into more of a general manager type role between recruiting your own team that you just brought in, fundraising, and less of the X's and O's type of role. Do you see this trend happening at Memphis?
Yeah, I think it's kind of inescapable. And when you ask Ryan Silverfield about things like that, he'll basically say that, this is what college football is right now. You have to re-recruit every player on your roster when the season ends. And if you had a successful season like Memphis did, then it's even harder, right? So, like, the season ended and Memphis had this big moment getting to win a bowl game in your home stadium. And then it's like you're walking out of the stadium, and now you've got to call every single player, not only on your team, to say, hey, do you want to come back? And then you've got to go recruit guys from other programs. And what I've noticed also just throughout this offseason is, like, it never ends. Like, there's no, there's like quote unquote dead periods, but there's not. Like, there's you can't stop. There's no time to take a break. And I think that, that it changes, and he'll talk about, the job that he has now is not the same job that he took when he became the coach in 2019. Like, it's just not. And you kind of have to adapt, or else you're going to get left behind. We see programs that are getting left behind. And obviously Memphis has adapted. And then with the FedEx deal, moving forward in a way that nobody else has yet with that kind of a deal. So, yeah.
Do they have like some sort of like GM where you kind of know what players are coming? Like you can kind of have an idea of what players are going to come back, or like how does that work out there at Memphis?
Yeah, so I mean, Memphis has a general manager, like, and brought somebody in this offseason to be a general manager, which is, again, I mean, I wrote a story about it when it happened because general manager is not a title that you normally hear in college football, right? In college sports, like that's, and so even when he came in, I was like, what is this general manager? Like, I've never heard of that. And then you look around at other programs and they're starting to do it too. Now, people have different titles. It's similar to obviously what you would think of a director of scouting, but there is something to be said for like, suddenly you're scouting and you're trying to get all these recruits, but somebody has to every season assess your own roster as if they're recruits basically. And it sounds crazy to do, but if you don't do it, you're in danger of losing everybody. And it doesn't matter how well you do in the transfer portal. Like if Memphis had lost Seth Hennigan and Rock Taylor, we wouldn't be talking about the expectations right now for how great they're going to be in 2024. And so that becomes the most important part if you're already a successful program. And yeah, so there you go. You go to general manager and you've got all these new positions that are kind of just popping up around that.
We've talked about it several times tonight, and I think the expectations outside the program are high, and certainly the expectations within the program are high. If you had to define success and what it would look like in 2024, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the one that I always ask Ryan Silverfield. And I think for Memphis, I think it has to be winning the AAC championship. And the reason I don't say going to the playoff is because you just never, someone's going to go undefeated and it's out of your control. Like it's hard to say. And you look at these other programs, like people talk about, obviously Memphis has this huge opportunity to go play at Florida State. Well, Boise State goes to play at Oregon. So if Boise State goes to Oregon and wins, I mean, they're in a position where they can go kind of do their thing and have control. So it's out of your control a little bit, but I think Memphis, you know, when you look at this roster, you look at who's coming back, you know, the continuity and the makeup of the rest of the conference with SMU leaving, with Tulane losing their coach and losing their quarterback. Now, I know who they've brought in. I know that I think they're going to be a really good football team, and I think they're almost underrated because of that. UTSA losing Frank Harris, like this, the team is different. The conference is different, and Memphis should, as we've seen, Memphis is projected to win the conference, and that makes sense. And I think if they don't, then that would be not a success. So I think winning the AAC championship is the marker this year for Memphis. And it's worth saying that's been the marker the past couple of years and they haven't hit it. But this year, Memphis is likely to be picked to win the conference with the expectations, at least externally, will be higher. And that'll mean they have to rise to hit them.
Well, is there anything else that you want to share or think that we should know about this 2024 Memphis Tigers football team?
I think we've gone through a lot. I just think it's going to be exciting as we get closer to the season. And with just the way that, you know, it's great that you guys are doing this year, obviously, because like the way that with the playoff, it just feels like there's more attention on the group of five kind of as a whole, because you're looking at all these teams, you're trying to pick, okay, we know there's going to be one, so we need to find who it's going to be. And you know, Memphis, and that's why Memphis fans this year are kind of like, we need to check up on what Boise State is doing. We need to, you know, what's Liberty up to? They brought their quarterback back? Like, okay, like, you know, who are they playing this year? They got the same schedule, and it's different, right, than it was last year when it was just, you know, the stakes weren't as high. And so I think, yeah, it's going to be exciting. It's going to be interesting to see how the buildup kind of continues as we get closer to opening day, which I'm already counting the days down. So I can't wait.
All right. Thank you again, Jonah, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you are watching on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you are listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until next time, we are the G5 Hive.